Like every nurse at the hospital, Molly Thompson always had a lot to worry about. Some patients needed an IV, someone else needed their temperature taken, others needed to take the meds prescribed by their attending physician. Since it was the middle of a wet and cold fall, the number of patients with acute respiratory diseases was consistently high. Unlike some of her colleagues, Molly never complained and never failed to perform her duties with diligence and humility. Moving from room to room, the young woman was like a real-life fairy, bringing joy and a good mood to the sick. Looking at the young and pretty nurse, the patients never even suspected how unhappy she was in her personal life. Molly and her fiancé Roger broke up a year and a half ago, and it wasn't on the young woman's initiative. Unfortunately, her fiancé was a very ambitious young man who decided to dump his fiancée from a poor family in favor of the daughter of a wealthy oil man. Molly was having a hard time getting over the breakup, unlike Roger, who got married 2 months later. Molly's mother was very unsupportive, reproaching her for not being able to get married. "What are you doing with your life? You'll never get married if you don't change your ways. You need to be bolder and take control of your own life," Rosemary Thompson said, which hurt Molly deeply. Meanwhile, the mother chose not to mention the fact that she too had failed to arrange her personal life and ended up having to raise her daughter on her own. Ever since then, marriage had become Molly's least favorite subject of conversation. "But you can't stay single forever. Think about your future. What about children?" Mrs. Thompson didn't let it go. After the difficult shift at work, the last thing Molly wanted to do was argue with her mom, who also was seriously ill. Rosemary started showing signs of cancer a year and a half ago, so during one of the routine medical checkups, the doctor recommended that she got a CT scan. It was then that Mrs. Thompson found out that she had serious health problems. Since her chance of recovery was quite high, the woman decided to fight till the end. Unfortunately, chemotherapy didn't give the desired result, and several unsuccessful courses later, the doctors concluded that Rosemary Thompson needed surgery. In all fairness, it should be said that the medical staff was very open about the fact that the surgery would cost the woman the kind of money her family most likely didn't have. Molly did her best to help her mother, all the while trying very hard to ignore her nagging about the young nurse's personal life, or lack thereof. Over time, the idea of getting her daughter married turned into a real obsession for Rosemary Thompson, which often brought her daughter to tears. At some point, Molly even caught herself thinking that she loathed going home after work. After all that was waiting for her there was more criticism from her mother, who continued to insist that her daughter needed to get married as soon as possible. So that day, having finished a taxing shift at work, Molly was in no hurry to get home. Instead of taking the bus, she decided to take a walk and get some fresh air to take her mind off of her sad thoughts. Even the cold fall wind that was trying to get under her coat couldn't make the nurse change her plans. To get to the other side of the street, Molly had to go through an underpass, which always had its own special kind of atmosphere. There were all kinds of people there selling books, pre-owned items, and flowers, but they all looked the same to Molly. All of them tried to sell something to passers-by who seemed to be completely oblivious to their presence. Of course, the underpass didn't only attract street vendors, but also all sorts of people experiencing homelessness who were looking for shelter in the wet and cold weather. They mostly stayed in small groups because it was easier to take care of each other this way and to pool their money together to get food. Passing by, Molly suddenly noticed a young man experiencing homelessness who was standing far from everyone and apparently didn't belong to any of the groups. The stranger's face seemed so familiar to the young nurse that she froze as if rooted to the spot. "That's Roger," Molly thought at first. But when the woman got a better look, she realized that she'd made a mistake. "Did you want something, miss?" the man asked kindly, which immediately made Molly blush. The woman stood there and didn't know what to say. The situation was so absurd that Molly felt embarrassed. Having looked into the man's eyes, Molly decided to ask him a couple of questions. Thus, a conversation started between the two. The nurse was pleasantly surprised by the man's charisma and the fact that he turned out to be very polite and courteous. The homeless man's name was Ethan, and he wasn't the least bit ashamed of the fact that he was living on the street. Despite this fact, the man looked rather neat, which suggested that he hadn't hit rock bottom and continued to take care of himself even while being homeless. Molly talked to him for a bit longer until she suddenly decided to voice a crazy thought, which had been spinning in her head from the very beginning of their conversation. "Ethan, can I ask you a favor? I'm not crazy, I promise, but I want you to be my fiancé. To pretend to be my fiancé, that is, in front of my mother. For a little while. Do you get what I'm saying?" Molly asked, embarrassed by her own frankness. The man looked into her eyes and smiled ingenuously. He gave it some thought and accepted the woman's proposal. The homeless man saw hope in Molly's eyes that could also be felt in her every word and gesture. "Okay, I don't mind. I can be your fiancé for a couple of hours, or even a month if you want," Ethan replied calmly, and immediately took the astonished Molly by the arm. That day, they already came home together like a real couple. Of course, it wasn't actually so, but Mrs. Thompson didn't know that and treated her daughter's pretend fiancé with outright hostility. After giving Ethan a contemptuous look, the woman proudly retired to her room. Molly understood everything without words. "Well, she isn't happy with me again, but don't worry, it'll be fine," the woman whispered, winking at Ethan. The guest smiled back, although he felt very uncomfortable at that moment. However, the hardest part was still ahead of the couple. At dinner, Rosemary Thompson deliberately asked the guests some embarrassing questions, and to answer them, Ethan was forced to honestly admit that he was experiencing homelessness. The mistress of the house immediately got a contemptuous expression on her face, which didn't bode well for Molly and her friend. Seizing the moment when Ethan went to the bathroom, Rosemary went up to her daughter and very bluntly told her that she'd made a wrong choice in life yet again. "That man doesn't have a cent to his name. What kind of future do you two have? Are you going to beg for alms in the underpass together? Or start a family in a homeless shelter?" the woman said mockingly. However, this time, Molly wasn't going to give in to her mother's will and was going to stand her ground. Molly decided not to say anything about this unpleasant incident to Ethan. She made a bed for him in her room and went to sleep on the living room couch. Molly was so tired after all the talk about marriage that her mind simply couldn't stand her mother's negativity anymore, and therefore she finally decided to stand up to her. The next day, she cooked breakfast for Ethan as if nothing had happened, and the two of them went to the grocery store together. They kept joking and laughing all the way to the store and back, and actually enjoyed each other's company. If Ethan hadn't told Molly about his social status, he could have easily passed for a wealthy man. A few months flew by. During this time, the relationship between Ethan and Molly had changed beyond recognition. Mrs. Thompson continued to ignore her daughter's fiancé, certain that he was a con man who decided to get his hand on their house, which he would later sell. But Molly could no longer imagine her life without Ethan. The former homeless man became the center of the universe for her, and she truly wanted to spend the rest of her life with him. Unbeknownst to themselves, the young people actually started the kind of relationship they pretended to have at first. Of course, Rosemary Thompson was against it, as their union seemed completely unacceptable to her. Before meeting Ethan, she insisted that Molly needed to get married as soon as possible. And now she became an ardent opponent of this idea. One day, when Molly was out at work, Rosemary Thompson decided to use this opportunity to pull off a trick that she believed was supposed to return things back to normal. "Ethan, I always wanted to ask you one question. Do you know that Molly actually has a fiancé?" Mrs. Thompson asked out of the blue. The man froze and immediately changed in the face. "What do you mean, a fiancé?" was all Ethan could say. In response, Rosemary told Ethan that Molly was engaged to the son of the local landowner and that they were going to get married soon. Ethan didn't even finish listening to the woman's story. He simply grabbed his things and ran out of the house as fast as he could. Looking after the man, Rosemary breathed a sigh of relief, believing that her problem was solved. And when Molly came home from work in the evening, she didn't even bat an eye when she lied to her daughter, saying that Ethan had abandoned her and went back to live on the street. "What do you mean he left?" "That can't be true. Ethan would never do something like that," the woman exclaimed. Feigning genuine surprise, Rosemary quickly retired to her room. Meanwhile, Molly remained standing in the middle of the living room with tears in her eyes, still unable to believe that Ethan had really left her. Having a hard time stopping herself from making any rash decisions, Molly was ready to run after Ethan, who apparently preferred life on the street to the warmth and comfort of her home. Hearing her daughter crying, Rosemary Thompson, for the first time ever, caught herself thinking that she had been too cruel. A week passed, which seemed like hell to Molly. Not an hour went by that she didn't think about Ethan, bursting into bitter tears. She even came to that same underpass where they met a couple of times, hoping to at least see her ex-fiancé, but Ethan was never there. Moreover, Molly started feeling sick in the mornings, which she mistakenly attributed to stress and exhaustion at first. But when the woman finally realized that she needed to take a pregnancy test, it came back positive. "God, I'm pregnant, and Ethan is the father," Molly whispered with tears in her eyes. Now that the nurse knew about her condition, she felt even worse about everything that had happened. Molly was embarrassed to tell her mother about her pregnancy, and her colleagues would hardly have reacted to such news with due understanding and compassion. But there was no way to keep such information secret for a long time, and a month later, everyone found out about Molly's pregnancy. The nurse wasn't going to have an abortion, and therefore she intended to have the baby and raise it on her own. Upon learning of Molly's pregnancy, her colleagues started talking about her behind her back and pointing fingers. They couldn't understand how anyone in their right state of mind could date a homeless man. Molly stoically endured all the mockery, and when she felt like there was no one to help her in her difficult situation, a bunch of expensive cars stopped by her house. A minute later, a man came out of the first car. He was holding a huge bouquet of roses. The stranger was dressed in a business suit, which made it obvious that he was very well off. But when Molly opened the door, she nearly fainted. It was her ex-fiancé standing at the door, smelling of expensive cologne. "Ethan!" Molly exclaimed, rushing to hug him. The man smiled and hugged her back. A little later, over a cup of tea in the kitchen, Ethan told the dumbfounded Molly and her mother that he wasn't actually homeless, but rather the son of a wealthy businessman. "I got into a huge fight with my father and left home. I lived on the street trying to stick to my beliefs and break free from the money and luxury that surrounded me since childhood. A day later, I met you and fell in love at first sight. During the time we spent together, all I could think about was how to tell you the truth. It was only when I faced the terrible lies that I realized that I needed to make peace with my father and return to my old life," Ethan said, expressively looking Mrs. Thompson in the eyes. Rosemary blushed and looked down, feeling ashamed. But it wasn't all that important anymore. They talked for about an hour, after which they all agreed that Molly and Ethan would get married in the very near future. The businessman knew about the woman's pregnancy and didn't hold a grudge against her mother. Instead of being bitter, Ethan sent Mrs. Thompson to one of the best clinics in the country, where she got the surgery to remove her tumor. Thanks to the professionalism of the doctors, everything went well, and the woman went on to undergo a rehabilitation course in a health center on the ocean coast. Meanwhile, Ethan and Molly held a magnificent wedding ceremony, which came as a completely natural continuation of the amazing and extremely unusual story of their relationship.